This is a framework that I've been kind of working with developing over the past couple of years, really, since AI came out, and thinking about like how do students interact with AI in the learning process. So I've got this simplified model of an educational ecosystem where you as the instructor are getting information represented by the black arrows, like knowledge and skills from your disciplinary and your pedagogical knowledge. You're funneling that into your course content activities, and then students interact with that course content and activities to gain those knowledge and skills and go out and apply them in the workforce or in the world. But then we've had a disruption here to the ecosystem. So wasn't the first and won't be the last, but it's kind of the biggest storm cloud we're dealing with right now. And it's impacting, I think, kind of multiple areas in this ecosystem. So generative AI came along and is kind of changing this flow. And so I want to zoom in for a bit on genAI, just to kind of get to the basics of how it works so that we're working from a same shared kind of understanding. So most of what we're talking about for these tools are large language models, which are trained on huge amounts of data so that they can recognize linguistic patterns, context, and in some sense of the word meaning. And so essentially they're very complicated word prediction tools. They predict the likely next word based on context, and they're able to consider semantics and relationships between words in a way that like interacting with them and the language that they output sounds relatively human, right? Like it has kind of its own tone or style, but it still is very sophisticated use of language. And most tools now can also work with images. So I just wanted to note how these work. If you're putting an image into a language model, it's going to first decode that into text and then decode that text into tokens. That's how it deals with everything. And if you're working with an image generator, those have also been trained on huge amounts of data using diffusion models, where they take these images and they add random noise pixels. And then in the process of reversing that noise, it teaches the models the relative positioning and details like color of pixels needed to create certain images. So because of what these models are and because of how they were trained, they have certain constraints. So hallucinations is one that hopefully people have all heard of, where, you know, a generative AI will throw a word in there and not know if it's an accurate fact, right? So that they have no way to verify the accuracy of their own statements, except for the models that are integrated with web searches or other reference materials. But those models still are prone to hallucinations. So for example, ChatGPT-5 will still make up citations to like research articles or make up quotes from people if you ask it for a quote from a famous author, unless it's like a very famous quote, so that those words are the most likely, you know, next word. It'll kind of pick things that that author might say, but it's not correct, because for each word, it is making a prediction for what is the most likely next word. And so it's easy to hallucinate a quote. And then you pair that with this next piece, which is overconfidence, and that's not a great combination, right? Like the models are trained to kind of like hedge some information, but really you won't ask a generative AI tool something and have it come back to you and say like, there's not enough information about that. I can't answer that. Like it does have training to, you know, say I can't give medical advice and that kind of thing, but I don't know isn't really like an answer that these tools can come up with, because again, they're just predicting words. They're not referencing facts. These tools also tend to be overly agreeable, and that's also due to their training. So humans were involved in the training, and humans would, you know, rate how much they liked an answer. And we like it when people agree with us. So when a model agrees with what you're saying, then that gets like a reward. And so these models are trained to be overly agreeable. And that can lead to some weird things. Like there was a recent article in the New York Times of a man who went through like a delusional spiral through this long chat with ChatGPT, and it had convinced him that he had come up with a new formula that would reshape how we think about space and time. And he really believed it. And the model really kept on that kind of delusion, even when he was saying like, well, this doesn't seem quite right. Are you sure? And it just had that overly agreeable loop went in a very strong and strange way. Some of these constraints are a little bit more outdated. So models do have difficulty prioritizing information. Like if you want an essay that has 4 paragraphs about one topic and then integrate that last topic just in the final paragraph, for example, it's going to have a little more trouble with that kind of thing. And then negating information, it's gotten a lot better at this. But it used to be, if you gave it a word, it would then, use the words related to that word in its response. But they have gotten better, I think, at that semantics of understanding, like don't include such and such. These models don't have mathematical ability, even though they are better at math than they used to be. They still solve math problems by statistical likelihood, not through like a logical step-by-step. Although some models will like internally prompt themselves kind of over and over to approximate that step-by-step process. And these models have biases replicated from their training data. So, they were trained on human language, and humans have biases and stereotypes. And so that is part of these models' training and reference frame. And so an example of that might be you could ask ChatGPT to give you a story about a nurse and a doctor and give the people names, and it's most likely going to give the doctor a typically male sounding Western name and the nurse a typically female sounding Western name. And so, yeah, as Hala mentioned, the AI detectors have a similar set of constraints following from these constraints of genAI itself. So these are also essentially probability generators, and they analyze the perplexity, which is the unpredictability of words. So if a series of words is very predictable, it's going to have low perplexity and be more likely to be generative AI. And they analyze the burstiness, which is the variation in sentence structure. And again, if that's low, then it's more likely to be generative AI. So that's how those detectors tend to work. But some issues with that is that it would be pretty easy for students to avoid detection through either a more genuine collaborative writing with genAI or introducing a few words of their own or some intentional typos. More advanced AI models may have higher perplexity and burstiness, and some students, English language learners, there's some preliminary research suggesting students with autism or others may have just naturally low perplexity and burstiness in their writing, so they would get flagged as genAI. That's just their writing. Okay, so the learning process, how does that play out when students are trying to interact with these tools? I have the blue arrow here representing energy. So students have to invest energy in engaging with their course content and activities in order to gain this knowledge that comes out of it. But I think a lot of what we're seeing is that instead they feel like, oh, I have to invest less energy if I work with a generative AI tool. But then I think what a lot of instructors are intuiting, and I think we are seeing is actually the case through research, is that that knowledge gained is a little bit more patchy. It's not as much of an investment in the learning process, and so they're not gaining the knowledge and skills that we've set up for them in the course content and activities. I think part of this might come from misaligned expectations or understanding about course tasks. So when a student is sitting down to work on, the work that they have for their week for 4 courses, maybe they have like an essay due, a discussion post, a problem set, and they're studying for an exam, that can start to feel very quickly like a to-do list where all they're being asked to do is complete tasks and give deliverables to you, their instructor, almost like a workplace model where I think it can be easy to get in the mindset of, okay, my instructor wants this essay because they want this deliverable. They want the outcome. And so if you're thinking of it in that model where what you're doing is creating a deliverable and it feels more like a workplace, I would argue that it's actually pretty reasonable to use generative AI in that case because it gets you to the deliverable, and it's what we're seeing happen in the workforce, right? Students are being expected to use these tools when they get jobs. But if a student is sitting down and approaches all of those as tasks that are going to advance their learning, tasks that are going to engage them in effective learning strategies like active recall or deliberate practice, it becomes much less reasonable, if that's your goal, to use genAI, because it is going to offload so much of that cognitive process that you're not going to be engaging in active recall or deliberate practice if you're using generative AI tools for a significant portion of that work. And I want to highlight those learning strategies because I think this understanding of the learning process and metacognition and reflection on learning is going to be pretty important as we enter this era of these tools that engage in so much cognition or cognitive tasks. And so active recall is one of the most effective learning strategies for understanding concepts or knowledge, where you're bringing information to mind from memory. So you're strengthening those neural pathways by not having the book or notes in front of you and regurgitating that information. Or if you're engaging in a more skill-based practice like writing, then deliberate practice is required, and that's effortful improvement of skills with feedback. So does generative AI have any business in this process? Maybe, kinda. So generative AI can walk learners through course content as a tutor. It can be prompted to have students engage in active recall. ChatGPT has a new study mode that I haven't played around with much, but you can also just prompt a generative AI chatbot to not give you answers, to quiz you on things. But students have to know to do that. And if they don't know to do that, we've actually seen with some generative AI tutoring tools that students can get frustrated when the chatbots are asking for them to tell the program the next step or the answer. And then we kind of see them just go offline or tell us oh, I just went to a different generative AI tool. These tools can provide real-time feedback on writing or other assignments, and so that could help with deliberate practice, but there's concerns in that. They have bias issues. They lack your course context. These tools also, because they want to give you the statistically most likely word, they're homogenizing, and so it kind of puts everything towards a certain average. And with pretty minimal prompting, they will just do the revision for the students, and it makes it a lot harder if you're working with a tool like that to really engage in that effortful improvement. These tools could also make assignments more accessible by kind of breaking them down, answering questions, but they again lack the course context that maybe takes away from relationship that you would rather have with students as the instructor. And they will confidently hallucinate and tell students yeah, you should do it this way, when that might not be what you as the instructor would suggest. So I saw a comment like this in the chat that students are using genAI for a variety of things. And so we have kind of a normal distribution here in the reports that we've seen of how students are using genAI, with a minority down here at the bottom who are not using it all. And then again, a minority at the top who are submitting totally genAI created work. But most students are falling somewhere in the middle, where they're just kind of getting topics from it, generating ideas, outlining and organizing, editing their work, or editing genAI created drafts. So we know then that they're interested in using it, but maybe don't know the most efficient ways to use it. And most of them are not using it to circumvent the entire learning process. But again, they're not likely using it to engage in those most effective learning strategies of active recall and deliberate practice. I actually find this a little bit comforting in that this is not a new problem. Students, for a long time have been highlighting or rereading their textbooks or their notes, which are learning strategies, but are not most effective learning strategies, similar to how maybe using generative AI to outline your essay is a learning strategy, but maybe not the most effective learning strategy. So we are seeing this troublesome shift in the learning process on behalf of students. Although again, maybe it's not a new problem that they're finding inefficient ways to engage in learning strategies. What can we as instructors do to encourage some shifts back towards what we would feel is more effective. And again, it's going to take energy, right? These blue arrows representing energy, understanding generative AI, and maybe modifying some course content. And so I would suggest transparency about the learning process as one way to help encourage that shift. Being clear and consistent about reminding students that course content is not a task to complete. You're not most interested in the deliverable of the essay. You're interested in promoting the student's learning process. And learning is best done through active recall, where they're bringing information to mind from memory, or deliberate practice, where they're engaging in effortful improvement of their skills with feedback. As I go into some of these suggestions here too, I also want to say, like, I don't have a silver bullet for this, obviously. If I did, I'd be speaking at much larger venues with much greater compensation. But it's going to take kind of like a multi-layered approach. So, in addition to kind of making the learning process a little more visible for them, reviewing your own course and its learning objectives in light of a world with generative AI. So you already probably know kind of your learning objectives. What are the skills and knowledge that students need to gain from your courses? But do any of those change in a world with generative AI? And we're at a point now too where a lot of professionals, if you know people in the field, people in your discipline, are kind of know how things are moving and changing for their jobs. So you can kind of get that information now without guessing as much as it used to be. And are there ways that generative AI can be incorporated in the process while still building key skills? So I spoke to some writing instructors at Northwestern Michigan College the other day, and they were saying, like, yes, we want them to use it for grammar and punctuation so that they can get those base skills without us having to spend all the time on those base skills. And our writing class can now be about kind of elevating their practice beyond that. So are there ways that you might do that for the knowledge and skills relevant to your courses? And then course and assignment policies. So if you are going to, there's a session this afternoon that Jeremy Van Hoff is leading, and he will go into this in detail. But based on your course goals and your understanding of skills in a generative AI context, what is your generative AI policy? When can students use it without circumventing the learning process? And that might vary based on like the point in the semester or based on the assignment. And what Jeremy is recommending is a clear policy not only in your syllabus, but also on each assignment. And that can be integrated in a pretty unobtrusive way, but you almost want to think about like, all right, here's the deadline for assignment, here's how many points it costs, here's how you can use AI. And I don't think that will be necessary to do forever, but students are going to have very different policies from course to course. They are, I think, in general, a little bit anxious about these different policies and how they might use AI. And so I think that level of clarity is going to be helpful for now. And if you do have kind of a more loose AI policy, having some kind of format for students to be able to disclose how they used AI will be helpful for them. If you're offering opportunities to engage with generative AI, I think students do need information about how to critically evaluate output for hallucinations, bias, lack of appropriate context, how to integrate generative AI into their learning process and reflect on their learning, and then ethical considerations, which we don't have a lot of time to get into today, but we do have various resources for that available at ai.msu.edu, and I can suggest some if people have particular questions. And this is also a piece that I think we won't need to do forever. Like, I think there needs to be some kind of like programmatic level consideration of this, because students don't want to get AI literacy in every single class of theirs, but they need to get it somewhere. And so if everybody can add like some little pieces of it, we'll get a little bit better coverage for now while we figure out where does it fit within their educational program. If you are blanket banning, which I'm sure there are some courses where that's the most appropriate way to approach it, the students who are better at AI use may be more likely to get away with it. And so I think considering that when you figure out what your consequences are for students who violate the policy, just know that like the students who have the higher AI literacy, who have the funding for better AI models, who have stronger English language skills are going to be more likely to get away with it, and those other students are the ones who might be more likely to get caught. And again, yes, there's lots of ethical considerations in any use of AI. So the bias that we touched on, the intellectual property rights of training data, which is less of concern if you're using enterprise tools, because we have agreements about what happens with, for the inputs used for subsequent training, we have agreements for that. The intellectual property rights of training data is a concern for all the models. Environmental impacts of the energy required to run AI in the data centers, and access equity for students who are engaging with various AI models.